So today and Friday's lecture, these lectures are all examples meant to help you get, hopefully you're already started on your homework, but get finished with your homework, especially getting started with objectives 4 and 5 of the homework. We had 3 lectures of going into the slides, showing you how Docker Compose work, and the idea behind that API closed, damn it. And the idea behind that API, now it's time to get in the code, get our hands dirty, and start running this stuff and showing you how it actually works in practice and as you're working on your homework assignments. So let's do exactly that. Kind of have a little variety of examples that I'll show you today. This can be pretty open-ended. If you have questions, things you want to see, especially if there's something that's driving you crazy on your homework, definitely let me know. I'll watch the Discord channel. This is one of them lectures. Really, whenever I go, if I can get there, whenever I go to the live examples and I'm doing live demos, I don't mind getting off track if it's something that's going to help the class more. If it's going to help you all resolve an issue that you're having with your homework, maybe whatever I have planned, I always have a backup plan in case nobody asks questions, but maybe what I have planned just isn't helpful. Maybe everybody knows that stuff and it's obvious. So if that's the case, please ask questions and be like, wait, how'd you get that Docker running? You just did one line and everything worked? I'm having trouble with that part. So please, oh, God damn it. Or we don't get Wi-Fi and can't have chat anyway. Oh, son of a bitch. Do I have mobile? I have mobile data, so at least turn this off. If I remember. Oh my God. But I assume everyone will have that same problem. Why can we not get Wi-Fi? There's an access point right there. How do I not have Wi-Fi? This is absolutely absurd. You must complete a few more steps before you can talk? Oh my God.
Oh, that's just what's not loading. It's not actually.
Oh, okay. That's just saying I don't have internet. I can't even. I might not have the Discord open. If there are questions in Discord, if somebody wants to be a liaison and raise your hand and ask me, that would be fine. But let's get into demos. I want to move my laptop so I'm a little more comfortable standing here.
We have somebody saying that they'd like to see how to confirm that a body in a post request is interacting with MongoDB.
Okay, how to confirm that the body of a post request is interacting with MongoDB. Okay, we can do that. I think that'll be answered in what I have prepared. There are a few things that I do really have to get through. But I'll make sure to emphasize that when I get to that part. Because that is tricky. Making sure, sending a post request and making sure that actually gets to your database, it's not easy to test. And one of the actual labels on this is, how do we test that API? Because that is tricky. It gets tricky. Testing a lot of web stuff gets trickier. Like we showed you unit testing in 1.16, but we can't really use that except in very small contexts in web development. Really, you go to the browser, you load your app, and you hope it loads. And if it doesn't, what do? Debugging web apps is a whole new world of testing. I got no connection. Frickin' A. Well, I'm at least turning my Wi-Fi back on. It's probably my better bet than mobile. All right, so let's get into this. I'm going to spend quite a bit of time in PyCharm. My preferences are set different than on my other laptop. For those of you who like to argue over light mode, dark mode, I'd like to welcome you to high contrast mode. This is my favorite. So if nobody else likes that, I could change it back, but this has been my go-to. Yes. I think it's amazing too. The dark mode just seems so faded. This is so vibrant, it just pops out. I'm liking it. I like it. All right, so I want to show you a few things, and I have to be very careful when I'm showing you things in this because I have quite a bit of homework solutions here. After homework 1 is due, I'll show you more of this server, and then I'll expand this and show you even more as we go through the semester. But I want to show you a few things. I'm going to start with something that I highly recommend. I only recommended it once or twice so far this semester, but I'm going to show you an example of how to set up your overall server in a nice, clean way, a way that I like. You don't have to do this. This is not required by any means. But I have a lot of students who ask me throughout the semester, like, you recommend doing something better, but what do you recommend? So right here, in your handle method, most of you, so this is a Python server. By the way, let me just give the overview. I'm using a TCP server from Socket Server, hosting on localhost 8000. And that's the whole setup. I'm importing Socket Server and then a bunch of stuff. This is code that I've written. These are my modules that I'm deferring to other files to keep my project organized. Most of you, especially at this point, I would expect you even to, in this handle method, have a big if statement, if, else if, else if, else if, else if, else. So you're going to have you're going to parse the request. You're going to get this request. You're going to decode it, parse it, get all the information you want out of it. I'm deferring to my requests class in this, which takes the request as a constructor parameter and then parses everything into fields for me. So the request type, the path, the body, the headers, all that's parsed inside that class. So of course I'm not opening that file because that's like most of homework 1 solutions in this request.py. So after homework 1, I'll crack that thing open and show you how to do homework 1. So anybody who wasn't able to get everything can see what I expected for that. So you would get all that information parsed, and then right here you would have if method equals get and path equals slash serve index.html, else if request equals method equals get, path equals slash functions.js, then send the functions.js file, else if, else if, else if. Else if path starts with image slash, then do this, else send the 404. So that's what your server probably looks like right now. Hopefully it at least looks like that. Those of you who haven't started the homework, if there are any of you, get started. There's quite a bit to do. You don't want to be doing it last minute. That's how you get zeros. I'll give a brief warning on that. The students who work last minute, sometimes you'll get to like objectives 3, maybe 4. You'll get quite a ways through the assignment. Maybe you'll even get it done last minute. And then what happens a lot of times to those students is they submit in a hurry because they're working right at the deadline, and they submit with an error in their Docker file because they were testing locally and they forgot to switch everything over to Docker and Docker Compose before submitting. And then they get 1s on all objectives because they don't have a proper Docker setup. And then they complain to me, hey, I got all 5 objectives right at the last minute. I did it. I actually did it. I pulled it off. Well, yeah, but you didn't because you didn't do Docker. Like, it didn't work right. So don't fall into that trap. Test with Docker, make sure everything works before submitting, and also after submitting, as I recommend. Download your zip and make sure it all works. Anyway, so I'm not doing that else if statement. I think that's gross. Any actual framework you use, like outside of this class, you're not going to start with a TCP socket connection. So any actual framework you use isn't going to say, write a big else if block and handle all your requests that way. Instead, they're going to say, give me a method type, give me a path, and give me a callback function. I'll call that function whenever I get something that matches that method and type. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm just calling router.handleRequest. And when I initialize this, I'm using the constructor in Python. If you haven't done OOP in Python, this is the constructor. You override this in it, and that's going to be called when the object is created, just like any other constructor. So my constructor, and I have to call the superclasses in it. I have to take these parameters because that's what the base request handler takes, and then forward them to the superclasses constructor. And then I get to add whatever I want. So here I have several classes that are going to add paths to my router. which I'm importing from my code, util user paths. Actually, let's start with other paths, static paths. So static paths, this is that other paths. And call the add paths method, give it the router, and then I'm going to add the routes. This is what I'm replacing that else if block with. I'm going to say if I get a request that's a GET request for function.js, call this callback function, which I defined down here, which is going to send a file. It's going to send my functions.js file, the MIME type, text JavaScript char set UTF-8, forward the request in the handler, and this send file is another method that I've written that's going to actually send the file to the user. It's going to open that file in byte mode and generate the response. This is another method that I've written. I like to encapsulate things. I don't like methods that are more than like 5 lines long. Maybe that's me. But once a method gets too long, depending on what I'm doing, for web stuff, usually 5 lines is plenty, because there's a lot of methods that it's easy to write a method that's doing like 18 different things. Break that up into the simple things. This method is reading a file and then deferring to the next step to actually generate that response. Generate response is going to formulate the HTML, HTTP response. I'll crack this open a little bit. I'll get a little risky here because this has a little bit of solutions. But I don't think what I just showed you makes sense without showing this off. So here, my generate response method is going to take the bytes to send. This doesn't work with strings at all. So if you're sending a string, convert it, encode it before calling this. I shouldn't show this much code this early anyway. I'm going to see all this cut and paste in my frickin' office hours. I don't mean to be bitter about that, but and then put the response together. I don't have much else to say about that one. Get the headers, the body, the new lines, all this stuff formulated, and then send that over the server. So I can encapsulate stuff. I can debug a lot easier. A lot of you by the end of the semester, hopefully not, hopefully some of you take this advice seriously, but some of you will have one giant handle method that does literally everything for all 4 homeworks, all in one massive 1,000-line file, and it's going to be an absolute nightmare to debug when you have a bug late in the semester because you have no idea where that bug's coming from. And if you're doing that kind of stuff in industry, your team will have many choice words to say about your programming methods, programming approach. So if you encapsulate things, have multiple files, even a directory structure, organize your code, take those ideas of OOP and FP that we taught you in 116, take those seriously, internalize them, use them to help you write large programs, because this server will get pretty large by the end of the semester. Don't just jam everything in that handle method is my best advice. And the big kind of hurdle for that is, well, how do we get rid of that else if? So I have that add path method, or add route, which just adds the route. And then when I have to handle a request, so I get a new request from the user, my router gets that request, and it needs to know, okay, what callback function should handle this? It's going to go through all of the routes that were added. For each route that I added, I'm going to check, is this a match? Which is going to check if the method is the right method, well, or rather, if it's not the right method, then it's not a match. If it's the right method, and my regular expression matches the path for that request. If the path of the request matches the path of the route, then this is where we want to go. We can't just do equal equal here because we have some paths that have parameters in them. If I'm getting a specific user, it'll be user / and then the ID. So we have to use some form of regular expressions to check does this path match this pattern, not match this exact string? Because we can't do things like starts with, well, I guess we could, but it'd get a bit more complex. But pull out your regular expressions and use these regular expressions to match those paths. If the regular expression matches, then we're good. And if it's good, then we're going to have that route handle the request and then stop searching for more routes. Only one route is going to handle a single request. So we end that right there. Python developers would hate me for putting a return statement in there. Scala developers would hate me for putting a return right there. Python developers are a little more forgiving, so whatever, I'm going to use it. And then if none of these hit and I never hit this return, send the 404. So that right here, this is my loop that would have, this would be my else if else if block. I'm replacing it with this nice clean loop, and that's it. And then I can have my paths. If you ever worked with a framework, you probably noticed that you can split your paths up into multiple files. You don't have to have them all in one big server file. I can have all my objective 1 through 3 paths right here. I'm going to use a dot, which means at least one character after the slash. My regex is going to handle that and say, okay, if the request is for /image/ and then anything else, that's a match. But if it's just /image/, then that's not going to match if there's no name after the image. That's pertinent to the users API. So I have all of the paths for objectives 1 through 3, and I can split the paths for objective 4 and 5 into a separate file. I can say if this method and this path, all that start with users, but importantly, we have get/users and get/users/ and then an ID. I want those to be 2 separate paths. I can do that since I'm using regex. I can use that dot to say at least one extra character after the slash. And then I'm good to go. And then I have methods for each one of those. My router is going to handle which method to call, or functions actually in this case. And then once I get a function called, I can work on this function in isolation. When I'm writing this function, I'm not thinking about routing. I'm not thinking of HTTP. I'm not thinking about anything except when a user wants to create a record, what do I do? Actually, I can show this. There's not much going on here. What do I do when a user wants to create a record? Well, I'm going to read the body of the request. I already parsed that and put it in a field in my object. I already have that all parsed. So I'm going to grab the body. I know at this point it's a JSON string, so I can safely decode it. Actually, we haven't talked about that. That's a homework 2 thing. Sometimes the body will be an image. We can't convert it to a string. We don't have to mess with that quite yet. But we're going to decode this because we know it's a string. I know it's a JSON string, so I'm going to pull in my JSON library and convert that string into a Python dictionary. In objectives 4 and 5, I have that disclaimer that says you don't have to do data validation. We're not going to dive into that, especially not in homework 1. You don't have to do data validation. You can just assume that everybody's using the API properly, that this is a string, that it is a JSON string, that it represents a JSON object with the fields, username, and email, all properly formatted. You can assume all that. Well, we're not going to go down that road of data validation. It's more tedium, and it's not hitting the learning objectives that I want for this homework. So you can assume it's a JSON string. We need to add an ID to it. We're going to tell our database to create it. So I'm not even doing database stuff in here. If I did database, this is general software engineering principle. We don't want a method that does 2 things. If we did the database stuff here, we have parsing the request from the user, turning that into an object, and also adding it to the database. If you have to describe what a method does with an and, it's probably 2 methods. It should probably be 2 methods. So this method is going to handle the request of a user creating an object. And when it gets to the database stuff, I'm just going to defer to my database file, which is going to handle the actual creation of that object and any communication with the database. And get the next ID from the database. That has to be a database operation. Hey, database, give me the next ID. Assign that ID to this object that's being created. Save that in the database, and then respond with that data with a 201 created. I forgot to put the MIME type in the homework document, so you'll get away with that if you don't have the right MIME type. But it should be application JSON. I haven't even mentioned application JSON, so it's not on the table for us to check during grading. But it should be application JSON. And then send the response. I actually don't like the way I set this up. This method shouldn't be handling actually sending the response. It should return with a response object, and then something else should handle the response. But hey, we got pretty far with organization. So since I've shown it in lecture, I know some of you will just do this, and that's fine. I'd rather see a lot of you just doing this rather than seeing so many else if blocks, because it's also a pain in office hours, the TAs and myself. When you have one big 1,000-line method, especially when we get to homework 4, and you got all 4 homeworks in there, and you say, this doesn't work, and we're scrolling through hundreds of lines of code to try to figure out what's going on. At that point, I usually just say, I'm not going through all this code, man. You have terrible practices. We taught you better in 116 and other classes. I know I taught you better in 116 if you took it with me. Do something better, please. Even if I have to give away the code in lecture, do something better. That said, if you don't understand this or you just don't want to, don't do it. Just use the else if block. That's fine. And I'll still try to help in office hours. Like I'll grumble a little bit in office hours, but I'll still do my best to help you. So I say that with a grain of salt. But all right. So the big question is, or rather becomes, how are we going to test this thing? So I'm going to go to, I already have it running. So I haven't done a Docker Compose demo yet. So let's do that right now. I have my Docker file. Looks just like we saw in lecture. I have my Docker Compose file. Looks just like we saw in lecture. I don't know if I did this restart always in the lecture example. I don't think I did. But that's how I have things set up. Docker file. My app itself is going to run on port 8000 with a host of 0000. In my Docker file, I'm exposing 8000, which is actually optional once you're using Docker Compose. Docker Compose will go and expose the necessary ports if you map them. I'm going to wait for the database. In my Docker Compose, I'm going to map 8080 to 8000, so I'm in compliance with the homework doc. Even though my app's running on 8000, since Docker Compose is mapping 8080 locally to 8000 internally, we go to 8080 to access the app. I'm going to wait for my Mongo. I'm creating my database and creating my app. So I should actually type this to show you. So when we're ready, we go Docker Compose. Everything's all defined in the files. Docker Compose up. Did I change anything? Actually, I always like to do this anyway, so I'll show you. Docker Compose up, and I always like to have the -- build. I'm sitting here asking myself, did I make any changes? If you do -- build, that's going to, it's going to take a little while, so let me run it. -- build is going to rebuild your image and also run your container. Docker Compose up runs your container from an image. Build says rebuild the whole thing. So if you made any changes to your code, add that -- build to make sure you get your latest changes in the container. And you also notice in my code, wrong one. I'll have these flushing standard out and standard error. If I do any print line debugging, which when you're in Docker, I lose the ability to run a debugger, so I'll sometimes revert to print line debugging. If you do a print line for debugging, make sure you flush standard out and standard error right after. Make sure you actually get to see that stuff in Docker. or else your output won't show in Docker. And I see some output. So this is good. This is what we want to see, but I want to show you just a little bit of what's happening here. My app is the first thing that does something. My app is running, my container for my app is running, and the first thing it does is call that wait command, and the wait command is in a loop that checks every once in a while if the database is running. It gets its first check right away and says, okay, I'm checking if MongoDB is ready. MongoDB is not ready. MongoDB is still running through this lengthy startup script. It's got a lot of processing to do. So my container checked, said, oh, it's not running yet. And then it's going to sit there and wait for a little while. It's going to check again. Still not available. MongoDB is still going through its startup script. Checks again. Now MongoDB is available, and now my app is finally listening on port 8000. So it waited for the database. That's what we want to see. We don't want to see our app start up right away before that database is ready, or else our connections won't be established. There are ways you can code it to get around that. If you want to connect to the database when a request is received, I've seen students get away with that. But with this wait command and connecting right away when your app starts up, for my money, I like that solution. So we can go to our browser. Localhost 8080. And yay, homework 1. Goodness, that blew. And I'm printing out the requests. We got a request for the root path. After that, we got a request for the flamingo. We got another request for the style. We got another request for the functions, the JavaScript. And we got another request for favicon.ico. You'll see this often in your requests. You don't have to handle this. You can just respond with a 404, which in hindsight, why am I not adding this to homework 1? But this will be the icon, a request for the icon in the tab. So the browsers will automatically send this to say, hey, what icon should I show my users in that tab? And we're saying 404, I don't know, whatever. We should just add a favicon path. And then that's the end of the request. So I also have some API methods set up. So I can go to my browser and like users, and we'll get away from this bright color. Users, oh, I was already playing with it. And we go to a brighter color, sorry about that. Let me just scrunch this down. Or actually, we're going away from this anyway. I do have data in there, so I meant to clean the database before lecture, but I do have data in here. So we can go to the path. That's easy enough for /users and /users/ID for the GET requests. Going into this address bar, you're going to send GET requests. Beyond that, we would have to write some custom HTML to be able to do what we want it to do. Well, we're not going to do that. I mean, you can. If that's the way you want to do it, I ain't stopping you. But I want to show you a better way. Postman. Postman is a very powerful tool. I'm only going to show you the very basics of it. But Postman is a tool used for testing APIs. That's what it's designed for. Is my browser not in dark mode? Is that my problem here? It wants to be in dark mode. It's designed for testing APIs. It's a very commonly used tool out there in industry. It's something that's worth getting to use. When you do go to Postman, you have to create an account. It is one of those things. They let you use their service for free, though, so I ain't complaining. Create an account, and you also have to download the Postman desktop agent. Nothing will work until you download that desktop agent. If you try using it without it, it'll come up with a pop-up and say, hey, did you download the desktop agent? It's hard to miss, but you do have to download that to get this to work. So I'm going to click this, start something new. I want to create a new request. And I'm going to create a new HTTP request. There we go. That's better. Come on, where's the button? I'm going to create a new HTTP request. Now, I can do the same thing that I just did. 8080. Let's go for the root path, actually. I'm going to send this request. That's actually going to send a GET request to this path, and I can see the response. It's going to be my HTML. I can see all the data. I can see the headers. I can see all the information about the response. But that's fine. We can just do that in the browser console. What gets really powerful is this drop-down right here. Holy crap, we can choose whatever method we want. So I'm going to choose post. Actually, let's do get. Get first. So if I get users, I can see that user list that we saw before. So I'm hitting my API and making sure the data is what I expect it to be. But we change this to post. Now we're getting more powerful. This is something we can't do in the browser, at least not easily. And I can go to body. I mean, we can change anything. We can add custom headers. We can add, oh, there it is. I'm like, where's the button? We can add cookies. And we can change the body. I'm going to choose raw for the body and JSON. I'm going to send some JSON to this thing. And I'm going to write my JSON string. Email. Test at example.com, because I'm never creative, especially when I'm on the spot. Username. Lecture user. I don't fucking know. And send it. So I just sent that request to my server. I got a post request for /users. I got my content length, content type should be in here somewhere. All set for me through Postman. And user agent, we can tell that this is a Postman request. By the way, your servers get a lot of information about your users. When you're using the internet, the servers you connect to get a lot of information about you. Like when I was sending this from my computer, they get quite a bit of information. They know I'm on an Intel Mac. They know what browser I'm using. They know my IP address. They get some information about me. And then the body of the request is going to be whatever I typed in that body. So I get this request. I can check, is my server sending the right response? If I'm a TA grade in this thing, I'm saying that looks pretty good. I got an integer ID sent to me. I got the same email and username. And if I send this again, I'm going to get another ID. I got a self-recommending ID. Cool. And then we can switch this back to get. We can say no body, send it, and we can see all of that new information is there. So that question of how do we tell that this went into our database? Well, we haven't quite tested that yet, but we can at least test if it made it into our app. So when I posted things to the API, I can at least verify doing this that those requests did make it into the API and everything's working from the user perspective. I don't necessarily know that it made it into my database, but I do know that it made it into the API from the user perspective. Let me catch up on chat in case I missed something. You can write web unit tests for sure. But it's a little limited in scope. It's difficult to write a unit test for the web that actually fires off an HTTP request or communicates to the database. So the general strategy for that is to push any of the TCP or web stuff and any of the database stuff off to the edges, off to the fringe edges of your app. So in my code, I have a database.py file. That's the only file that's going to talk to my database. Everything else can be tested. And if I'm testing something that talks to the database, I'm going to replace, or what we call stub out, or mock that database file with a test file that's just going to check if it was called, or I'll replace it with something that uses data structures so I can test my other code without needing to spin up a database for my unit test cases. Same with my web stuff. I'm going to simulate sending the bytes of a request. Like when I'm testing my Like when I'm testing request, that takes a byte array that is an HTTP request. So when I'm testing that, I just give it a byte array in my unit test and make sure it parses it properly and gives me all the right stuff. I don't have to spin up a TCP server to test that method. The only thing where the TCP interacts is this code right here. This code is hard to test because I need a TCP server, but all it does is print something out, defers to something else, defers to something else. And those something else's I can test without the internet, without TCP, without any of those connections. So there are ways to test web apps pretty thoroughly using unit testing, but it does take some setup and some foresight to set things up like that. Okay. My eyes, sorry. Jesse, when everyone has the same code. All right, so I do have to crack open that database file a little bit too. So one of the questions in here, if this is localhost, or if I just leave this blank, nothing's going to work. That is trying to connect to a local database, local to the app container, which there's not going to be any database running there. We want to say Mongo, because Mongo is what I name this right here. If I name this Mongo 25, this right here needs to be Mongo 25. That has to match. Another common mistake, which I'll be honest, I actually made when I was preparing this example. Where am I? Docker Compose. I overlooked it while I was doing this example. It's something I know to look for in every office hour ever, and I myself made the mistake and wasted like 20 minutes looking for it. This can't be localhost. If your host is localhost, or if you leave it blank, it usually defaults to localhost, nothing's going to work. This will work when you test in Python. If I just run this file, everything's fine. I go to localhost 8000, and everything's fine. When you run this in Docker, this won't work. Docker won't be able to see. I like that matches your laptop. Docker won't be able to see that. Docker needs to be able to see it. If you do 0000, this is saying allow connections on everything. I don't know the exact details, sorry, but there can be security issues with this because it does allow access from outside machines, but our outside machine in this case is Docker. This will allow Docker to access this. So we need that 0000. I had localhost because I was testing in Python. I went to Docker. I'm like, why can't I get anything working? If you have localhost, you go to the browser and it'll say site can't be reached. Nothing works. Nothing happens. 0000. Always remember that one. Before we go into the database, I meant to say this sooner, but I got caught up. Postman's so exciting, you know. So when you're setting up your database, I had some questions about this. The TA said some of you are using Mongo Atlas, which is not allowed in this class. I know that's... So when I teach different classes, like whatever's right for that class, that's what I'll teach. That was right for 442. So if you saw me in 442, I was showing you Docker, and then I said, but you can use Mongo Atlas, and let's set it up that way. That was the right thing to do in 442 for various reasons, mainly because we were deploying to Heroku, and Heroku didn't like Docker Compose at all. Here, we like Docker Compose. Docker Compose is actually a learning objective in the class. Docker Compose is something I want you all getting practice with, Docker and Docker Compose. This is something you will almost inevitably, every one of you will see in industry, depending on what field you go into. If you go into web development, anything, distributed systems, web development, you're going to see Docker Compose, and you're going to have to spin up multiple containers. If you're taking another class in this department, there's a pretty good chance that other class is using Docker and Docker Compose. If you're taking distributed systems, if you're taking this class, and there's one more that the TAs were mentioning that that a lot of you are taking. I forget which one. Some of you are taking 3 classes that use Docker Compose, that are all teaching you Docker Compose right now. It's something we need you to know. There's a reason we're all saying this. It's because it's used in industry extensively. You're going to see this, and I want you to get in practice with it. So when you run your database, you have to run it in a separate container like this. You have to have Docker Compose running at least 2 containers, one of them being your database, the database that you actually use to store your data. Don't just superficially slap a database in your Docker Compose and never connect to it. We will look for those things during grading. And then your app. So your app and your database as 2 separate containers and having them communicate with each other. That's something I want everybody getting practice with, especially if you're not taking distributed systems. This is where you're going to see that. This is where you're going to get practice doing that, setting up multiple containers. So I want you at least running 2 containers. By the end of the semester, we'll be running 3 containers. We're not getting crazy. This isn't distributed systems, so we don't need like however many they do in that class. I don't know off the top of my head. But we will run 3 by the end of the semester. So you do have to run your database in your Docker Compose using Docker Compose. So with that said, why am I? Oh, because I'm not presenting. So I went the wrong way. So with that said, I need to hear you say it. Tell me that you understand this. Oh, I got to read chat. Yeah, you can use the browser to send post requests, but it's just not as easy. And when you got to do post and put and delete, all with different paths and different bodies and stuff, it's easier to use Postman. Yeah, 442 doesn't allow Docker this semester. It's back to PHP only, deployed on Cheshire, right, if I'm not mistaken. That's what it usually is. It was only different last semester when I did it. And it caused issues. By giving you that much freedom, it caused a lot of issues too. So it probably will be PHP moving forward, no matter who's teaching. Even if I taught it this semester, it'd be PHP, unfortunately. Y'all can't handle the freedom. Most of you can, but some teams take that freedom and have way complex architectures, and then they go to deploy, and of course it doesn't work because they don't have any clue what they're doing. It just causes so many headaches, and we're spending the whole semester talking about deployment. People want multiple containers because they went through one tutorial, and that's the way that tutorial set it up. So they set it up that way because they don't know any better, which is fine. You're here to learn. But then when they go to deploy that, they don't know what to do. So because of those issues. And then the PMs don't know what to do because they're using this really complex architecture. And no, we just don't want any of that. With one architecture, it just keeps things more simple. So those of you going through that in 442, I feel for you, but there's no good answer to how to structure that course. Give you the freedom, and some certain teams will fail because of that freedom, or do we restrict it and make sure everybody at least gets something out of the course and succeeds in the end, even if you have to use PHP? It's a tough call. For 442 is still teaching Docker, though? Doesn't allow it, but teaches it? Everyone good on the lecture question? Okay. For the body idea, can't we just do it in the map value place params in Postman? Probably. There's a lot of ways to do things in Postman. If you do it like form data, is that what you mean? I don't know if that'll work will that convert it to JSON though? If that converts it to JSON, then fine. But I don't think form data does. Maybe it does. I don't know. But you'd have to play with it, make sure that it is sending the requests in the proper format. And you can beautify this if you want. Ooh, it looks pretty. Formatting. All right, so database. So now that we've introduced databases, you got to do it this way. Let's crack open this database file and talk about the database connection for a little bit. So for the database, I'm importing PyMongo. I'm connecting to the database using the name from my Docker Compose file. I'm connecting to a database, CSE 312. This can be whatever string you give it. If that database doesn't exist, Mongo just creates it for you. Just throw any string there, hopefully something meaningful, but if not, it'll still work. Get your database, and then get collections out of your database. I have 2 collections, one for users and one for user IDs. And then I'm going to use those collections to interact with my database. Now, I will give this to, just because this is such a pain in Mongo and so easy in MySQL, is how to compute the next ID. I'm going to have a user ID collection, and whenever that get next ID, you saw the method call in the other file, whenever I need a new ID, I'm going to go to my collection, find anything. I'm only going to have one document in this collection. This is just the way I set it. If you want to do something else, go for it. If you have something else that's working, do that. But this is the way I have it set up. I'm going to find one document. There's only going to be one document, so I'm just going to say retrieve the one document. If it exists, do this stuff. If it doesn't exist, insert last ID, a document with last ID of 1, and return 1. This is, the database doesn't have any IDs in it yet, so start at ID 1 and return it. If there is no record in there, grab the last ID, convert it to an int, increment it by 1. By the way, this is a bug that took me like another 10, 15 minutes to debug. Make sure you're converting this to an int, or else it'll be a very specific type that the database determines. It's not fun to mess with. Convert it to an int. Next ID is an int. Update your record using the set command. Update that to the next ID that was incremented. So update your database, and then return that value. I actually had a question about this. I will show the create as well. No. Sorry, I had to show another one. These get pretty simple if you do the most concise thing. I had this question in office hours, so I want to give a good answer to it. If you want to get something out of the database, we don't want that self-assigned, the underscore ID that MongoDB assigns. If you don't want that value, give find a second argument with that ID of 0 that says, give me everything except underscore ID. Super handy when you want to filter out those ideas, which in most cases I want to filter out those ideas. That's a MongoDB thing. I don't care about it for my uses. Get rid of that, and then use the list constructor. So in office hours, somebody was asking, do I have to go through this and manually pull username, ID, and email out of this? I did look into that. I didn't have a good answer at the time, but the list constructor will take an iterable, which all users is, and just put all that data in a list. So I just throw all users into the list constructor, done deal, done. Just make sure you're filtering out the underscore ID first, or else you will have to go through each one and pull those things manually. And since I have all my database stuff set up, can I do this real quick? I'm going to try to do this real quick because I don't feel like doing it on Friday. But if I open up a new window and go to my Docker, I can see my containers running with Docker PS. I'm going to go to my Mongo container, get the container ID, and you'll just have to take my word for this one since we don't have too much time. exec-it container ID bin bash is going to enter your container, and then I can do Mongo to enter my Mongo, use my CSE 312 database, db, oh my goodness, db.users.find, is that what I called it? I hope so. And I can check and make sure that that is in my database. So I am actually using my database in this case, so we can verify, and I can finally get to that, answer that question from the beginning. And with that, we're out of time, so I'll see everyone Friday.